So yesterday we continued learning about the story of Hannah, and also some of the lessons that we see from the fact that Eli's his actions, that we learn laws about tefillah, about prayer. So the first thing is we mentioned about the fact that it says 3 times Amasecha, 3 Amosos it says, and we explained that the 3 times is either hinting to the fact that by a woman, time of childbirth is a dangerous time, and she is judged on her adherence to the laws of Nida, Chala, and Shabbos candles. And not to say that men are not judged when they're in a time of danger, because they are also judged when they are in a time of danger. But specifically, women are judged about these 3 things. And that's what she was discussing with Hashem. And she was saying, Hashem, did I ever transgress any of these laws that I shouldn't merit to have a child? Or on a deeper level, what she was saying is that, is it possible that you are being kind to me, that instead of making me die during childbirth, you're causing me just not to have a child? So in other words, is that what you're doing? Are you being kind to me, Hashem, by not causing me to die during childbirth? But I've never sinned in any of these 3 areas. I've been careful in these 3 areas, and therefore, why won't you give me a child? In other words, that she was, in a certain sense, giving an excuse to Hashem. Maybe you're not giving me a child because you're trying to be kind to me and do an act of kindness, that you're not causing me to die during childbirth. So you're saying, better, you know what? I'll do Hannah a favor. I just won't let her get pregnant, and that will be instead of her dying during childbirth. And Hannah says, but that's not so. I've never sinned in any of those 3 areas. Did I ever sin in any of those 3 areas? So that's what, on a deeper level, that's what Hannah was saying to Hashem, and basically begging Hashem for a child. So she said this word Amasecha 3 times, and I mentioned to you that it's either from the fact that she's saying Amasecha, which has in it the word base.
In the bedroom, in the middle room there. Yeah, you go in there. Yeah, okay.
Either from the word mace, or from the fact that she's saying, I am your loyal maidservant, and I fulfill these mitzvahs very, very carefully. Now, the next verse tells us, the next verse that the Gemara discusses told us about what type of a child did she ask for. So she said Zera Anoshim, which is a strange language. So the Gemara has to try to figure out, what is Zera Anoshim? So the Gemara had different interpretations. Either it means a man among men, someone that's distinguished and sticks out and is special. Shmuel says someone that's going to anoint 2 men, and that's means he's going to be a prophet that will anoint David and Shaul. Or another explanation is someone that's equal to two great men, and that's equal to Moshe and Aaron. And we have a verse that implies that Shmuel is in the same league as Moshe and Aaron. And the rabbis say no, that all she asked for was a regular person. She did not want someone who's special. She asked for Hashem for a child that is just normal. And the term is muvla bein anoshim, someone who is, just gets hidden amongst the men, meaning it will just will be undistinguished, so to speak, unset, just regular guy. And the Gemara explains that she didn't want someone too tall or too short or too fat or too skinny or too dark, too light, too white, not a chacham and not a tippish, not a wise and not stupid. And so the question is, was that request fulfilled? Because she seemed to get a very special child who became a big prophet. So either that request was not fulfilled because she ended up getting a child, and we'll soon see that at the age of 2, he was already knowledgeable in the Talmud. It sounds surprising, but there are kids that are just born as prodigies, and this kid seemed at the age of 2 seemed to be quite knowledgeable, which we'll soon see. Yes, Susan.
The strange thing is that first she says, I just want a regular kid, not anything special, but not too tall, not too short, not too white, not too dark, undistinct. I mean, first she says, I want a regular kid, but then she has all these buts. And I find that there's some kind of hidden.
That's just a translation of what regular means. She's just that's just translated Talmud.
Translation of
the rabbi is just translating it.
Okay, yeah. Okay.
That's what normal is. That's what regular.
That's what they considered. I understand. Now I understand. Okay.
So, so the other way of understanding it is that the child was born regular, and somehow he became brilliant after he was born. But either way, that was the way the rabbis explain different opinions of how to explain what type of a child did she request, did she ask for. Now, the Gemara then came up with a lesson from the story. And as I read for you yesterday, the verses that it mentions that Eli HaKohen was in the was in the Mishkan and Shiloh, and she came and said her prayer. And Eli at that time misjudged her. And then she came back 2 years later with her child, and she wants to give her child to Eli that he should be educated by the greatest scholar of the time. And she's giving her child, entrusting Eli with her child. And she tells Eli this line, I am the woman who stood with you here. Now, the Gemara is trying to interpret that, either because it could have used the word itcha, nitzeves itcha. It doesn't have to say nitzeves. Could say that was with you. She's saying, I'm the woman that was standing with you. So there are the two ways that we explained it. We explained Rashi's pshat is that what she's saying is, I am the woman who stood with you. That means you also stood up when I prayed. Which means that Eli was sitting down, and he specifically stood up when she was praying. And from that, we see that it's prohibited for a person to sit within 4 amos, within 4 cubits of someone who is praying. And we discussed yesterday some of the reasons for that. Different reasons are mentioned among the commentaries.
Rebbe?
Yes.
If he thought she was Shikora, why did he stand up?
So it sounds like a good question, but it sounds like before he was able to figure out she was Shikora, he saw her start davening, and immediately he stood up. And afterwards he realized that it seems like she's Shikora, and whether he asked the Urim B'Tumim and was more convinced, or however you explain it, but it seems like initially he stood up and thought she was Shikora. Now, that is Rashi's way of learning it. Your question would be answered differently according to Tosfos. Tosfos says that he did not stand up, but the reason he did not stand up was because the word imcha is spelled with a hey, with an extra letter hey, which equals 5. And what that word is telling us is that Eli was actually sitting down, and he stayed seated, but the reason he stayed seated is because he was 5 cubits away from her. Had he been within 4 cubits, he would have been obligated to stand, but because he was in the hey, the imcha, the extra letter hey is teaching us he was 5 cubits away, so he wasn't obligated to stand. So he stayed. So he was sitting. So the verse is telling us that a person who is within 4 cubits would be obligated to stand, but he was outside of 4 cubits, and therefore he did not need to stand. And that's Tosfos' explanation. According to that, he did not get up, even if she wouldn't have been drunk, because he was outside of, he was outside. So he stayed seated. He didn't get up for her. He stayed seated. Now, could be initially he thought that she was regular and not, not drunk, and he would have stood up had he been within 4 cubits, but he didn't. Now, I will tell you a third explanation that we learn this not from the word imcha, the extra hey, but from the word bazeh. I was standing with you, bazeh. Bazeh, what is bazeh here? It's a little, it's interesting. It's not a typical word to be used here. It could have said pai or something, imcha pai, or it doesn't have to say it at all. It says the word bazeh with this. It literally means with this, which I think they translate as there, here, in this place. But the fact that it says bazeh, take the gematria, the numerical value of Zion and Hey, 7 and 5 equals what? It equals 12. That means I was standing with you within your 12 handbreadths, 12 amos, 12 cubits, which means that I was somewhere around you, either on the side 4 cubits, in front of you 4 cubits, or on the left side of you 4 cubits. So ultimately, I was in somewhere within your 12 cubits around you. Now, the commentaries want to say that maybe according to this interpretation, it proves that behind you, you do not have to, if you are davening, if you're not davening, if one person is davening, the other person is behind them, they could sit down, because even if you're within 4 cubits, because it's only 12 cubits that needs to stand. If you're within 12 cubits, means you're on the right side of him 4 cubits, in front of him 4 cubits, or on the left side of him 4 cubits, you would need to stand within that amount of space. However, if you're behind him, it doesn't say in 16 cubits. That means the 4 cubits behind the person who's davening, one does not need to stand, one can sit down. That would be one way of understanding this. However, it's not 100%, because there is a commentary that says this insight of 12 bazeh, with the word bazeh implies 12 cubits. And he also says that even behind the person, you're not allowed to sit down. So if one person is saying the Shemona Esrei, you are, according to this opinion, he says you're not allowed to sit down behind that person. So how do they learn? Why does it say 12 and not 16? So either 12 means 12 is 4 in front, 4 on either side, and 4 behind, or it means 4 on each side, 4 on the right side, 4 on the left side, 4 behind, and in front of you is possibly a different measurement than 4 amos. But basically, there is room to say, there's reason to say that according to this view, you would be exempt if you're behind the person davening. So again, what we're dealing with is the law that if someone is saying a Shemona Esrei, are you obligated to stand if you're within a close proximity to that person? And this is very applicable in shul and possibly in your house. Sometimes someone is davening and you're sitting on the couch. And so we brought up 3 scenarios yesterday. One is if you're behind the person, so the person's in front of you, would it apply then as well that you would need to stand? Another scenario was if you're studying Torah, would you need to stand? And a third scenario was if you're already sitting. If you're already sitting down and that person comes and starts doing their Shemona Esrei, are you also obligated to stand up? Or do we say that, why did you come to me? Why did you come here to say your Shemona Esrei? You should have not stood within 4 cubits of me. I shouldn't be obligated to go stand just because you came and sat within my 4 cubits. So these are the discussions that are based on some of the reasons that are mentioned, for this prohibition of sitting down when someone is saying Shemona Esrei. And I just want to bring, because I'm going to bring the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch, the Shulchan Aruch Harav, in chapter 102. In the first paragraph, he says that it's prohibited to sit within 4 cubits of a person who's davening, whether in front of him or behind him or from the sides. You would need to separate 4 cubits because the place that he is davening at is called Admas Kodesh. It's called holy ground because the Shechina is opposite him. So the Alter Rebbe puts these 2 reasons together. We saw them as 2 separate reasons. There's holy ground and there's the Shechina. But in the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch, he combines the 2 points that it's really one is based on the other. Because it's because the Shechina is there, so therefore the ground that you're on is holy, and you should act respectful in that place as long as the person is davening, and his area is called Daled Amais, is considered 4 cubits. So basically, a person should not be within 4 cubits sitting down while another person is davening, because that's not respectful to the Shechina's there, and the ground is called Admas Kodesh, holy ground. And that's based on the story of Moshe Rabbeinu, that Hashem told him, take your shoes off because the land that you're standing on, when he saw the burning bush, he said, Admas Kodesh, this is holy land. Where you're standing is holy, remove your shoes. And so that's a similar, the same verse. So that's the idea of the Shechina is there. You have to act respectful, and you should not sit down while the Shechina is there. Now, what happens if a person is studying Torah or saying praises of Hashem? So it says that would be permissible to sit, because when you're involved in Torah, words of Torah, it does not look disrespectful. It does not seem disrespectful as long as you're saying the Torah words with your mouth. But thinking in Torah doesn't help, because, and what is the reason? Why is thinking in Torah it won't help? In other words, if you want to sit down next to the person davening, so if you recite words of Torah, that's okay. So you're reading a holy book and you say the words with your mouth, that would be okay. Or if you're praying, that would be okay. But if you're just thinking it, it's not considered acceptable, because you are seen as sitting there, and the thoughts that are in your mind are not visible. So no one knows that you're thinking words of Torah. If you're saying words of Torah, then it helps. But if you're thinking words of Torah, it doesn't help, because the words that the thoughts that are in your mind are not visible. So it looks like you're being disrespectful. So what comes out from here is that it's not only what you're doing that is disrespectful, but it's how it's perceived. It's perceived as disrespectful, and that's what's not allowed. And therefore, if you're saying words of Torah, that's allowed, because you're saying words, and you're reciting. People know that you're saying Torah or you're davening. But if you're just thinking words of Torah, who knows? Maybe you're just in dreamland. You're dreaming. You're sitting and relaxing. So it looks disrespectful, and and therefore it would not be allowed if you're just thinking words of Torah. Now, what is the source of this halacha? The source of this halacha is the story of Eli. Eli was obviously learning Torah, right? What was he doing? He wasn't just walking around bored. He was for sure learning Torah. And yet we see that he stood up for Chana davening. Why did he stand up? He's learning Torah. Why did he stand up? He stood up because he was only thinking words of Torah. He wasn't saying words of Torah. Had he been saying words of Torah, he could have stayed seated. But if he was thinking words of Torah, probably. But if you're thinking words of Torah, you still have to stand up. Yeah. Someone had a question. Was it you, Susan?
Okay, I'm totally confused. If I'm sitting at my desk reading the Gemara and studying, going over my notes, what you said, I'm refreshing my memory and trying to understand. I'm not actually reading from Torah, but I have the book open and I'm referring to it.
That's a good question. You're asking a good question, Susan. We got your question. Good question. Susan is asking that if you have a book open and it's visible that you're learning, shouldn't that be good enough? It sounds like it should be. In the olden days, they didn't have books. But now that we have books, it seems if it's all about, it's not visible what you're thinking. But here you're even you're pointing with your finger, maybe even,
Yes.
If it's pretty visible, it seems like it should be good. Again, I don't want to
I'm not being disrespectful.
say 100% because the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say this clearly in Shulchan Aruch, but it does imply that it should be okay. So it sounds like a very good point, Susan. But
One more question.
But the point, I think you have to take the flip side of it is if you don't have your book open and you are trying to review, you should stand when someone else is saying the Shemona Esrei within your 4 cubits. Yes. Okay. What else did you want?
The other question was if I'm watching a video of the Rebbe and there's a lot of videos online. I was watching one last night. I started to cry because he was an incredible speaker. Am I being disrespectful by not standing? Because everybody in the crowd was standing. Everyone.
I think the reason why everyone stands was only because there's what? What'd you say?
I had no choice.
I think if the people stood over there because it was impossible to sit. There was no seats and there was no space for seats. The place was packed.
Yes.
So I don't think that the reason why they stood was because it was out of respect. It was more because it wasn't possible. So therefore, it's not an issue. It is interesting because the Gemara does talk about that. Before Rabbi Gamliel, there was a certain way they used to study Torah. Everyone stood, but after Rabbi Gamliel, people sat down when they learned, and so it's not an issue of standing out of respect in order to learn Torah. Yes, Ben.
I wanted to say I'm thinking maybe talking about the imcha spelled with a hey.
Yeah.
That maybe she means I'm standing with you now, with you and God, on the question that I asked you and you blessed me, and now I want to tell you that God gave me a child, that your blessing came true.
So why is she telling him, by the way, I want you to know I'm standing with you now? Of course she's standing with him now. Why would she say that? It must be she's telling him I stood with you then.
Standing with the meaning of we are on the same subject. You blessed me. That was my request. God filled the request. So I'm here to tell you the story.
So it's not the way the Gemara understands it.
I understand.
The Gemara is understanding it maybe on a literal explanation, yeah. but it doesn't,
because there must be a reason for the hay there. Instead of a half sofit, they added the hay.
Right.
So
There's a reason.
The hay represents usually godliness.
So you're trying to explain the hey according to Rashi. Tosfos has an answer why there's a hey, but you're trying to say why? How does Rashi learn? Why is there a hey? That's a good point. Ben is trying to figure out why would there be an extra hey there, according to Rashi's explanation. According to Tosfos, there's a reason why there's a hey, because Eli was sitting down, and the reason he was sitting down is because he was in the fifth cubit away from Chana, who was davening Shmona Esrei, or praying. But the reason for the reason according to Rashi is unclear. Why is there a hey? The truth is, I would have to pull up a Shmuel and see what the commentaries say. But in any event, it's nice to try to look into that. So thank you, Ben. Maybe we'll have to check it out. Okay. So let's continue. So we have the reason why the Alter Rebbe is saying if for this prohibition, it has to do with the Shechina and has to do with the land becomes holy, and it looks inappropriate to sit and you're thinking Torah, but no one sees that. Now,
how much is a cubit?
Either 18 inches, 19 and a half inches, or 24 inches, or maybe I think there's a fourth view, maybe 22 and a half. There are a few views of what it is.
An arm's length from the elbow to the end of the hand.
To the tip of the finger, yeah. But the question is, whose hand? Whose
I
arm?
know, so it's not a fixed, it's about.
Right. So there's difference of opinion somewhere between 18 inches and 24 inches.
So, are they giving any? Excuse me. Are they giving any allowance for being an elderly citizen who is handicapped and was tired? Eli was an old man, and the proof of it is when the messenger came to him and told him that the Mishnah was captured, he fell off the seat. He was sitting even then backwards and hurt and died. So there's a provision for a handicapped elderly.
Shlomo Yosef, you just hit a home run.
Thank you, sir.
Very good point.
What's
very
the
good
score?
Point.
Thank you.
1-0. You won. So the Shulchan Aruch, the tour brings us down, and the Beis Yosef on the tour they bring down that if a person is weak, so it has to do with the fact that people see that he's weak and that he can't get up. Here it's right here. It says in the Orchos Chaim that the Harav Baal HaTamid, that if a person who's sitting next to someone who's davening is weak and he can't stand up so much to wait till the person finishes his prayer, it seems that it's permissible for him to sit down. This is the words of this Sefer, the Baal HaTamid, and he writes on it that's surprising. What's the leniency that he? But the Beis Yosef says it seems to me it's not surprising because his weakness is visible upon him, and because of that he's sitting down. So it seems like the difference of the first opinion understood that maybe it's not so visible that it's hard for the person to stand, and the Beis Yosef is understanding it that we're talking about a case where where it's visible that the person, it's hard for him to stand. People can tell he's in a wheelchair, he's got a cane, he's got whatever it is. It's visible that it's hard for him to stand. So therefore, it's understandable that he doesn't have to stand because it's not disrespectful. Okay, so then and the Alter Rebbe brings this in Shulchan Aruch that in fact the next sif he talks about it, that if a person is weak, he's allowed to sit because it doesn't look bad. It's but he says you can rely on this if it's too hard for you to move. Like if you're in a wheelchair, it's probably better to wheel, if you could wheel yourself a few inches away, that you're to reach 4 cubits. Reach out of the 4 cubit zone. then that would be better. But that's the halacha. Now, comes the next question that I mentioned is what happens if a person is already sitting down and this guy comes and says Shemona Esrei, plops himself right next to you and starts davening. So what do you do then? So it says that you don't have to stand because that person came to your area and started davening. But that's only if in a place where you're not in a shul. But in a shul that's meant for prayer, there you would need to get up because this is a place that's exclusively meant for davening. And you don't have this claim that this guy came into my area and started davening. It's not, it's not like I'm being disrespectful. In other words, the point is it disrespectful what you're doing? So for you to just flop yourself and sit down, that is a problem because that's like disrespectful. But the fact that guy comes and starts davening Shemona Esrei, it's not disrespectful that you're not getting up. It's that you're, it's that you were sitting there. You didn't do anything. You're not doing anything. He came and started davening. Now, however, there is a midas chasidus to stand up to make sure that to remove there's a claim against that person that he came into your area and started davening. And causing that your sitting will be looked at as something negative. So what it sounds like is that it's not as much as it's not negative. In other words, maybe it does look inappropriate for you to be sitting. The only thing is we can't obligate you to stand because he came into your location. So we can't say that we can't force you to stand. This other guy did something. He came and started davening. We're not going to tell you, you have to stand. But it still looks disrespectful and it's his fault. In other words, whose fault is it? That's what it boils down to. Whose fault is it that this disrespect is being done? How do we look at it? If you're sitting already, it's really the fault of the guy who's davening Shemona Esrei. He shouldn't have come to you and make it look disrespectful what you're doing. No, you're not actively doing something wrong. You were sitting there before. You were on the couch. This guy comes and starts davening Shemona Esrei. So what you're doing, it looks disrespectful, but you're not doing anything disrespectful. He did an act that's causing you to be looking as disrespectful. So it's really his fault. So therefore, we can't obligate you to go stand. He shouldn't have done what he did. He shouldn't have gone into your 4 cubits and started davening his Shemona Esrei. And the source of this idea is that our Gemara says, if you look at the language in the Gemara, it says Asur leishev b'seich arba amas. It says it's prohibited to sit down. It doesn't say it's prohibited to be seated. It's prohibited to sit down within your 4 cubits. So what that sounds like is if you're already sitting, then it's not a problem. Because the Gemara says it's prohibited to sit down. Asur leishev. It's asur to sit down within 4 cubits of someone praying. But not that if you're sitting there that you have to stand. Not that you're not allowed to be seated. It doesn't say that. So what comes out from this is that it's really the other guy's fault. However, midas chasidus, an extra act of piety would be for you to stand anyway, even though you were sitting and you did nothing wrong, because you don't want him to be at fault. To save him from being at fault, this is appropriate for you to stand, because he shouldn't have done what he did that caused you to look to look that it's that you're doing something that you're in the midst of something that's not respectful. Yes, Susan.
So that's a mitzvah on the person that's already seated? That's
Yeah.
a good deed that,
It's a good deed. It's a midas chasidus. It's an extra act of piety.
Okay.
Now, there is a big question on this from the story of Eli. Think about the story of Eli. Eli was sitting down. Remember in chapter 1 of Shmuel, we saw it yesterday, that what was Eli in the midst of doing? He was sitting. And all of a sudden, Hannah comes in and she starts praying. And what does Eli do? According to Rashi, according to the simple explanation, he got up. But Eli was sitting before. Why did he get up? He shouldn't have had to get up. Okay, he was learning Torah, but learning Torah, he was only doing it quietly, so no one saw. He didn't have a book, so fine. But he got up. Even though he was learning, that's fine. But why do you have to get up if you're sitting already? It's only you're not allowed to sit down. But if you're sitting already, then you don't have to get up. And Eli got up. Why did he get up? So one explanation is that if you're in a shul, in a place that's special, that's expected prayer, I shouldn't say exclusively prayer, but it's set aside for prayer. And that would be like the Mishkan. So that would be one of the explanations, that because he was in the Mishkan, he was obligated to stand. But according to this Alter Rebbe, maybe you could say that also if it's Midas Chasidus, it is appropriate to stand because if you want to act extra pious, and he did that. He was acting in a Midas Chasidus. So this would give us an extra explanation of why he stood, because of the Midas Chasidus. Now, if we pull out a Mishnah Brura here in chapter 102, in the regular Shulchan Aruch, it says that it's prohibited to sit within 4 amos of someone praying, and the Beis Yosef, he says whether on the in front or on the sides, and the Ramah adds in or behind you. So the Ramah seems to be following that view of that you have to be careful even behind, even if you're sitting down, want to sit down behind the person, you shouldn't sit down within 4 cubits. Now, it says if a person is involved in prayer, you don't have to separate. But some permit if you're involved in Torah study also, even if it's not a prayer. And the Mishnah Brura adds in the same point, that it's specifically if you're saying the words. But if you're just thinking, then it's not good enough. Now, we mentioned another major reason for this law, and that was that you're not accepting, it looks like you're not accepting the yoke of heaven. And I mentioned that there's a view that says that if it's not prayer is not accepting the yoke of heaven. And therefore, if the reason that you're not allowed to sit down is because it looks like you're not accepting the yoke of heaven while your friend is, so that only works for prayer, but it doesn't work for studying Torah. Now, what's interesting is that's what the Torah says this, that if you're, that it doesn't work, this reason doesn't apply if it looks like you're not accepting the yoke of heaven. That doesn't apply if you're studying Torah, because Torah study is not about accepting the yoke of heaven. However, the commentaries on the Torah, the Beis Yosef, he says that that if you look at the wording, it says specifically the way the Goinim bring this, the way the earliest commentaries of the Talmud bring this, they say that this applies if a person is sitting doing nothing, Yoshev Bato. But if he's Isaac in Torah, if he's involved in Torah and Tefillah, if he's involved in prayer or Kriya, like Kriya Shema, blessings or similar, then it's fine to sit down. Now, the Beis Yosef says it would seem that only if a person is doing nothing, that's when it's a problem. But if you're studying Torah, you are accepting the yoke of heaven. And so this seems to be an argument between the Torah and the Beis Yosef about studying Torah according to the reason that we mentioned here. Again, we said we initially said a reason in the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch of the holiness of the place, and it looks like you're not respecting the holiness of the place, but Torah study is for sure respecting the holiness of the place, and therefore you can sit down and say the words of Torah is no problem. But according to the reason of accepting the yoke of heaven, the question is this called, and it seems to be the way the Mishnah Berurah seems to be using that reason, would Torah study be called? Seems to be an argument between the Torah and the Beis Yosef if Torah study is called accepting the yoke of heaven. So I think maybe what it depends on is how you're studying Torah. If you're learning Torah and really thinking about Hashem, then you're accepting the yoke of heaven. But if you're studying Torah maybe without having a lishma for the right purpose, then maybe it's a problem. So it would depend on how you're studying Torah, or maybe not. Does it depend on your specific study or what it looks like? So maybe it depends on the environment that you're in. People who study Torah, are they generally thinking about Hashem? Or are they generally just enjoying the intellectual stimulation of Torah or doing it not lishma? If most people study Torah for the right purpose, then it looks like you're accepting the yoke of heaven. But if most people in your maybe don't study Torah for the right purpose, so maybe then it doesn't look like you're accepting the yoke of heaven. So maybe it depends on the era that you're living in. Just throwing a thought there of the idea of Torah study and this argument between the Beis Yosef and the Torah. And the Shulchan Aruch brings down v'yesh matir ba'isik b'Torah, and it boils down to these two views. In other words, the Shulchan Aruch brings both views about studying Torah. So it seems maybe it depends on I'm just throwing a thought that it depends if it looks like you're accepting the yoke of heaven or not. How is it going to look like somehow it has to look like you're accepting the yoke of heaven. I don't want to bore anyone, so I think we've gone through a lot of discussed this at length. But yes, if you have questions, I think we'll conclude this discussion with your question, Moshe. Yes.
Okay. If there weren't any svorim, how would you be able to determine whether somebody's learning Torah or not, or they're just sitting there thinking about Torah? I mean, if they don't have any svorim, I mean, if they're moving their lips or the motions, I mean, the Meritayan is obviously present all around. But
you're asking a good question. Moshe is asking a good question. He's saying, I explained that there's a difference between saying words of Torah and thinking it, because when you're thinking it, people don't know. But if you don't know if you're studying Torah, but if you're saying it, then people know. But what do you mean? You don't have a book in front of you. So how do they know? But I guess the norm is that people don't talk to themselves. And therefore, if you're reciting, you're this guy's davening, and you're saying, you're talking to yourself, and also additionally, maybe you can hear the person. You hear him say, it seems like he's reviewing his studies, so he's talking to himself. In the olden days, that's how they used to study Torah. They didn't have a book, and they would know it by memory. So it looks like they're studying Torah. Again, most people don't talk to themselves, and additionally, you could hear him saying words of Torah. That would be my understanding. Yes, Yehuda.
Yeah, but how would that apply to Eli and Hannah?
So the story of Eli, the way we're assuming is Eli was probably thinking words of Torah, because a Talmud Chacham doesn't go anywhere without thinking thinking Torah. But at the same time, we don't know and therefore he felt obligated to stand up because
That's not what I meant. When Ellie thought that Hannah was drunk,
yeah.
how does that apply there?
So Ailey stood up for her. Ailey stood up when she was davening.
Not originally.
Well, Ailey was sitting there when she walked in. And then it says that when she was davening, she says, she told Ailey, she says, I am the woman who was standing, that was standing with you when I was davening.
I'm talking about the year before.
Okay, the year before. But she's now talking also about the year before. She's speaking now, 2 years later, about that episode.
He accused her of being drunk.
At that episode, he accused her of being drunk. So you want to know if he was standing then when he accused her or was sitting?
No. Just why did he not realize that she was davening?
So the thing is that he couldn't hear. Maybe that's a good point. That very interesting point you're saying. I just mentioned that when you daven, when you're learning Torah, you can hear the person. You hear the person. Here, she was saying words of prayer, and you couldn't hear her. So she was moving her lips, right? But she wasn't saying anything. So he said that's crazy. That must be someone drunk, because people pray and people learn Torah and they say words. And here the person is not doing either of those. She's moving her lips. She must be drunk. On a very simple level, she was drunk. So maybe is that what you're saying? That is interesting. Yeah. Very nice insight, Yehuda. So that would be the idea that's a very nice insight. So in other words, the point is that you normally can hear someone when you know what they're saying. At least if you move closer, you'll be able to hear them. We're studying Torah. And here, he couldn't even hear her, even if he went close, even though he walked close to her. To hear her, he didn't hear her saying Torah. Very nice. Okay. Yes, Ezra.
Well, I'm going to put forward a controversial point, but you have to think of what it was like back in those days, not where we are now.
Okay.
Women in those days did not study Torah. That wasn't the norm. And so therefore, to assume that, why didn't he stand? Because he thought that she was moving her lips and studying Torah or whatever it is, that didn't exist in those days. So therefore, for him not to stand would have been normal. So he might have gotten up to say something to her because he thought that she was, in fact, drunk. And her response was, no, sir, that's not what's happening. I'm davening to Hashem because this is what my situation is. All right. And that would have been a reasonable situation that existed in that time.
So I was not saying that he thought that she might be learning Torah. My point was she was, of course, davening. There was no question. But I was comparing the concept of him thinking that she was drunk with the idea that I just mentioned before that that you normally could hear someone when they study Torah as well. So he didn't hear her reciting words of prayer, so that meant she was drunk. And as you say, they didn't learn so much Torah. Now she was quite knowledgeable. So she obviously did learn stuff because she knew this idea of Saita. She was quite capable she definitely was knowledgeable. And so, to say that they had yeshivas for women, you're right. They definitely didn't. To say that that women didn't know. I mean, Devorah was the prophetess. I mean, she would judge cases. So there definitely was, knowledge. Torah knowledge amongst women in those days, But just for argument's sake. But the idea is not that he thought she might be davening. The point was that is the reason why when you see someone moving their lips is the reason. How do you know that they're really learning Torah? Is because you actually should be able to hear them. That's what it seems like. That's all I was bringing out from that. And here, when she was praying, he didn't hear her. And normally they used to pray out loud, and therefore he was convinced that she was drunk. That's all. But yeah. Anyway, you have an interesting point that in those days they didn't study Torah. Okay, so I think that concludes our discussion of this on this topic. Bottom line is not to sit down when someone else is davening nearby, especially if you're in a shul or in a place that's set aside for prayer. And but there are some leniencies if you open up a sefer and learn Torah and say the words of Torah for sure. And if you're davening yourself, and then you would be allowed to sit down even next to someone within 4 cubits of someone else who is davening. Okay, Chana, I'm sorry, where are we up to here? El Hanar. So we're about 15 lines up from the bottom, 2 dots. El Hanar has that. We're on 31b. 31b, about 15 lines up from the bottom by the 2 dots. El Hanar hazeh hispalolti. For this child I prayed for. And now this is a very shocking Gemara, because what it tells us is 2 things. Number one is that Shmuel was quite a scholar at the age of 2. And second of all, that the punishment that they wanted to give Shmuel for giving a halachic decision is also very surprising. In other words, Shmuel had been brought to Eli, he's about to be given over to Eli. And in the meantime, his parents are bringing a sacrifice there. And Shmuel is this little child. And the mother says these words, "For this child I prayed." And the Gemara says, why is she saying those words? For this child I prayed. She could just say, I'm giving this child to the base to you to become a prophet. But she's saying, for this child I prayed. Amar Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Elazar says the reason she said those words was because Shmuel was moira halacha lefnei rabbi. Shmuel taught a halacha in front of his Rebbe, and that's really not appropriate. You don't tell your teacher, a halacha, and it has to be done with proper respect. And Shmuel did that, and because of that, they wanted to punish him. Eli wanted to punish him, and therefore the mother said, "For this child I prayed. Please don't punish him." Now, what does this mean? He was giving a halachic decision at the age of 2. What in front of his Rebbe? Now, who is his Rebbe? So Tosfos asks over here, what are we talking about? Eli is his Rebbe? He never even learned from him. This is the first time he's seeing Eli. Eli HaKoyin, he's a great scholar, but he's not. How could you call him his teacher? He's just being brought to him for the first time. In fact, his father used to go every year and every holiday but Chana said, I'm not going now until my child is weaned, and then I'm going to give him completely to the Mishkan and to study with Eli. And so he didn't know him from Adam. And so what does it mean? He's Meira Halacha Lefnei Rabbi. So Tosfos says 2 things. He says, even though he didn't learn from him yet, he's going to learn from him, but he didn't yet learn from him. Nevertheless, he is a Gadol Hadar. He is the leading sage of the generation. He's the leading sage of the generation. And Tosfos adds another point. And he says, and he's coming to learn before him. So what comes out from here is there are 2 ways to learn Tosfos. Either Tosfos is saying one point, that your Rebbe is someone who is either someone who you learned the majority of your wisdom from. That's the norm. That's the regular term for Rebbe, Rabbi Muvhak, a Rebbe who's your Rebbe who taught you most of your Torah knowledge. That's one way, and that's the conventional way of a Rabbi Muvhak, of a real Rebbe. But there is a alternative way of being a Rebbe, and that is if someone is a great scholar and you go to study, if he's the leading sage of the generation and you go to study in front of him, he's also called your scholar, your teacher. Both reasons together. Another way of understanding Tosfos is they're two separate reasons. And each reason on their own is enough to call him your teacher. One would be if he's the leading sage of the generation, he's called your Rebbe. Everyone's Rebbe is the leading sage of the generation. A Gadol Hadar is considered your Rebbe. You have to have extreme respect for a Gadol Hadar because he's called your Rebbe, even if you didn't learn anything from him. He's the leading sage of the generation. That's one way of one point, one case, one scenario where you have to have respect as if it's Rabbi, as if he's your Rebbe, even though you didn't learn anything from him, but he's the leading sage. And additionally, there's another element of someone who's called your Rebbe, your Rabbi Muvak, is not that you learned from him yet everything, but you're about to. That's already called your teacher. If you're there in order to learn from him, he already reaches that level of Rabbi Muvak, your main Rebbe, because you're in the midst, you're about to learn from him. It starts from when you arrive. Once you arrive, he's called your Rabbi Muvak. Even if you didn't yet do it, it's called, I guess, the potential, because in potential, you're in the midst of learning from him, he's already called your Rebbe. In other words, it's not about how much he taught you, but it's about the fact that you're accepting him, or that he is going to be, he's in the midst of teaching you the majority of your knowledge. So however you want to explain it, he has that you have an obligation to respect him for that. Yes, Susan.
Okay, I wanted to ask you something. When you teach this class, do you say a prayer before you teach the class?
What prayer?
I don't know. That's why I don't know. Before I turn the computer on, I say, please God, let me understand what Rabbi Smith is explaining. That's what I say. Out loud, please.
Okay, now how does that connect to this Gemara?
Okay, I'm saying a prayer to understand what you are saying.
Right. Okay.
I'm not saying that I always accept the yoke of heaven. I'm talking about I'm accepting you. Okay.
I hear.
Okay.
Okay. Sounds good. I see what you're saying. Yeah. I should just mention there is a prayer that we say before studying Torah, and some Gemaras, some of the tractates, it's printed there in the first page, right when you open up. And that prayer is appropriate to say before. I try to say it before we study.
Okay. I didn't know that. That's why
I also daven in the morning.
Yes.
So I have a few prayers there before we study. But yeah, that's an interesting point. Yes, Moshe.
She may be referring to a Mishnah Berach before the beginning of the class, for the well-being of a person, or that they should have a refuah,
Okay, fine. All right. Well, so let's just summarize what we just spoke about. So that the story here is that Shmuel, we're going to find out that he did something wrong because he taught a halacha before his Rebbe, and we just explained two explanations, or maybe it's all one, of why Eli is called Shmuel's Rebbe. But the point is that, number one, he's the Gadol Hadar, he's the leading sage of the generation, or one of the leading sages of the generation. And number two is that he is coming there to learn from him, and that gives him the name of Rabbi, his Rebbe, that Shmuel would need to have a tremendous respect for, and Shmuel they're considering him to have transgressed that because this is called, Eli is called his Rabbi Mufak, his real Rebbe, his main Rebbe, even though he didn't learn yet anything from him. And to be continued tomorrow.